Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about parts of an experiment. We talked about the scientific method yesterday, and within that, we said one of the best ways to test your hypothesis is to perform an experiment. So today we are going to talk about the parts of an experiment. So I want you to keep this mock experiment in mind as we go through this today, because I'm going to use pieces of this as examples. So our mock experiment is to find the effect of fertilizer on bean plant growth. So there are 5 major parts of an experiment. There's your control group, your experimental group, your independent variable, your dependent variable, and then your constants. So what is a control group? A control group is the standard by which the test results can be compared. So in our mock experiment, the control group would be the bean plant with no fertilizer. The second thing is your experimental group. An experimental group is the subject being exposed to the variable under study. So the experimental group in this instance is the bean plant with the fertilizer inside. We are wanting to compare. The goal of this experiment is to figure out if a bean plant grows more with fertilizer or without fertilizer. So we're wanting to know the effect that fertilizer has on bean growth. So our control group is just the general bean plant, nothing is added to it, but our experimental group, what we're experimenting on, includes fertilizer. So our experimental group is the bean plant with the fertilizer added. So the independent variable, when you're independent, you can stand alone, right? An independent variable is the factor that, as it changes, affects the measure of another variable. In other words, it is what is being added and or manipulated in an experiment. So in our mock experiment, the fertilizer is being added, therefore making it the independent variable. The only difference between your control group and your experimental group is the independent variable. Now, the dependent variable, however, is the factor that changes as a result of changes in the other variable. In other words, it is dependent on the independent variable. So in our mock experiment, the example is plant growth, right? We are trying to figure out we're trying to figure out what effect the fertilizer has on plant growth. So the fertilizer is what's being changed, and the plant growth is dependent on the fertilizer. So the dependent variable is plant growth. Now, a constant is exactly as it sounds. It is the variable in an experiment that does not change. So an example in our mock experiment would be pot, soil, bean seeds, and water. When you're setting up your 2 groups, typically you always test at least 2 things against each other because you want to have a controlled group, and then you may have several experimental groups if you're testing different things. But in this instance, we just have the 2. We have a control group and we have a experimental group. Within both of those, we want to have the same constants. Those are not going to change at all. We want to use the exact same pot. We want to use the exact same soil, the same amount, the same brand. If we dug it up from the earth, we want to get it from the exact same location on the exact same day. With the bean seeds, we want to plant the exact same number. We want to plant them the exact same distance apart in both pots, and we want to plant them the exact same distance down within the soil. And same with water. We want to give the plants the same amount of water at the same time every single day. So these are the 4 things that we can control and that they do not change. And they are the exact same in both the control group and the experimental group. The only thing that's different about the experimental group is that independent variable. So once again, we have our mock experiment. We're wanting to find the effect of fertilizer on bean plant growth. So now that we've talked through everything, I want you to take a minute and think about what each thing would be.